What is up, slackers? And welcome to another episode of the Stuck in the Middle podcast. I am your host, Jason Eck. And when I was thinking about topics for this week, I began thinking about cliches, tropes, stereotypes. And the internet is full of these. Pick any kind of group, any kind of demographic. It doesn't matter what it is. There's always someone who has their own preconceived ideas about what a particular group is like. It also goes along with kind of self-identification of what people believe about their own demographic. So obviously this is a Gen X podcast, and I'm on a couple of different groups on Facebook, and I follow some pages on Instagram and Twitter where they're focusing on 70s, 80s, and 90s, all the things that are kind of right in our wheelhouse. And sometimes I'm shocked and surprised by how people identify themselves, even within Gen X, and the kind of amazing ideas that other generations have about us. It's just kind of fascinating. The reason I use the Stuck in the Middle as the title of the podcast is that there's boomers and millennials, so on and so on. And we're kind of in between the boomer and millennial generation. Now, there are plenty of pre-existing internet battles between boomers and millennials, right? Where we're kind of in the middle of some of these things. And some would say that Gen X feels like it's the forgotten middle child. And I completely relate to that as well. But we have our own series of, I think, preconceived ideas that come from boomers, right? And I don't mean boomers to be dismissive or even be rude. I don't want to use it in the same way of, okay, boomer. That's not fair, although I do say that on occasion. And then, millennials have a certain idea because with generations being so wide as far as, it's like 20 years, basically. Maybe not quite 20 years. So it's like, well, yeah, like a good 15 years is usually a generation. And I think that the boomers are slightly longer, but you could conceivably have someone who is a early Gen Xer who has millennial kids, right? But you can also have later boomers who have millennial kids. So you have parenting cohorts that are kind of overlapping and mixed up. So anyway, I was scouring the internet, and here's a couple of things that jump out at me. Things that people will say in one of the Facebook groups that I'm in, for example. Well, they'll say, well, how would you describe Gen X? How would you self-describe Gen X? Now, one of the things that people say is, we're the whatever generation. Whatever. Oh, whatever. Look, I completely enjoy the nostalgia of my teen years. I do. It's a lot of fun. A lot of the music that I fell in love with and we still talk about and listen to this day happened in my teen years and early 20s. But to think of things in that cliche of whatever, as though that is really the predominant characteristic, I just think it's stupid, and I don't relate to it. I mean, it's a funny thing to say, but you always know the people who kind of mean it. Like, that's their mantra in life. My mantra in life is, whatever. Come on. I joke about, what is up, slackers? We're not slackers. I mean, some people are, but they're slacker boomers, slacker millennials. We just kind of got the tag, and I just take it as kind of a badge of honor, right? Because we got associated with it. So I use it. I think it's funny. I think it's humorous. I don't look at it as being my ethos. I'm not a whatever kind of person, I'm not a slacker per se. Certainly when I was a teenager in my early 20s. See, I say that I was a slacker, yet I worked 3 jobs at different points, right? It's just all so silly. But one of the newest ones that I've seen on the internet, and it drives me bonkers, it's the, and I try to keep it clean on the podcast, right? So it's, we're the F around and find out generation. Really? That's what people in their 40s and 50s are posting on the internet to describe themselves and their, what generation we are. Knock it off. Knock it off. Come on. It's just, it's silly, and it drives me up a wall. So what is out there? What articles? You got your BuzzFeeds, your rankers. You got all these different websites that will go ahead and they'll post things from around the internet. So I was just looking around at, what is out there that people say are characteristics of Gen X. Now, I'm not saying that I agree with some of these, but, well, we'll go through them. So one of them here says, and I haven't read these. I just looked for articles, so I can just kind of do it real time. 5 Gen X characteristics that anyone born in the cohort will immediately identify. Okay, let's see about that, shall we? Okay. Okay, what does this article say? This is from a website called Pure Wow. As previously mentioned, the typical family started to look a little different when Gen X came around, namely more working mothers and higher divorce rates. This in turn led to more latchkey kids, children hanging out at home without grown-up supervision after school until a parent came back from work. For these reasons, self-reliance, plus a corresponding ability to stay above the fray, are among Gen X's most defining traits. But more on that below. Not everyone was a latchkey kid. Not everyone had 2 working parents. Not everyone had divorced parents. So again, it's rather generalized, and depending on your own personal experience, you may or may not relate to that. So, number 1, they're expert DIYers. Okay, so I'm not going to mention any names, okay? But there's a friend of mine, who I know listens to the show, by the way, that may or may not have had a situation where they got a little pissed about something or at someone, that person being me, and this led to a hole in the drywall, in the sheetrock. So I will say that we did not do a masterful job. It was mostly me, but my dad, that was his job. He laid sheetrock. So I was okay at it. So I guess there are certain things that I'm okay with as a DIYer, but I also know some people who don't know how to do a single frickin' thing. But again, that's going to be their experience and circumstance. So it says here, you were learning how to plunge a toilet by trial and error because your mom was at work. Yeah, okay, that seems fair. But all right, so we're 1 in, and I'll say that we're capable-ish DIYers, but I wouldn't say we're experts. Let's see. Their sartorial style is decidedly dressed down. Gen X rebelled against the excessive and flashy 80s by opting for anti-fashion staples, such as flannel shirts, Doc Martens, and oversized sweaters. Okay, so this is where I assume that the person who wrote this was a late Gen Xer or a Zennial. Because as much as I can completely relate to the flannel shirts and the Doc Martens, I didn't really oversize sweaters. I didn't really do that. I was very much a part of that hairband period. And I know that there were people, including people I went to high school with, that really got into like The Cure and like the Susie Sue, like that whole scene. So, rebelled against the, now a certain element did. Certainly a certain element did. But I mean, for me, would I prefer to be in a pair of jeans and a sweatshirt? Yes. This is the most comfortable thing, usually with a ball cap. But it says here, so despite its cross-generational popularity, Friends is very much a Gen X TV show. As such, you typically won't find Gen Xers chasing the next hot trend in fashion. Have you ever seen Genco jeans? Have you? Have you ever seen Genco jeans? Doc Martens, flannel shirts, that became fashion. Like, it's just such a silly statement. It's not rational because it's trying so hard to be kind of cool. Also, This group was rocking combat boots and slip dresses before it was cool. But they're so cool they don't even brag about it. What? There were definitely plenty of trends, and I will tell you some of them. Tattoos, piercings, manic panic, dyeing your hair different colors. I mean, there were so many things that were born out of grunge, for example, right? So grunge was the turning point. It got us away from the hairbands. But that in of itself became the fashion. Soul patches. Every dude had to have a soul patch at one point in time or another, right? Just such a weird thing. Number 3, they've got the whole work-life balance thing down pat. There's a reason why Gen Xers have been dubbed the work hard, play hard generation. No, that's boomers. That's mid-boomers. People born in the 50s on. That's them, not us. I'm sorry. Although that is at play sometime, I just think that's weird. Gen X childhood coincides with the emergence of the personal computer, a major development that helped individuals from this generation adapt to future technological advancements. Okay, yeah. We got pretty comfortable. You know, you do gain some work-life balance by having some technological savvy. Most importantly, Gen X entered the workforce at a time when technology had not yet made possible the notion of being on call 24/7. So I will tell you that as soon as I reached a certain level of my career, who were my bosses, right? So when I first entered into management and then into middle management, my bosses were by and large boomers. So there was somewhat of an expectation, if you're going to be in an executive or junior executive role, that you were kind of on call. Now, I don't really talk much about what I do, but I will say that within my role, I kind of oversee many different aspects of the organization that I work for. Everything from finance to facilities. So I've gotten used to being on call for a long time. So I'm not really sure that that's distinct to anyone, and it also depends on the job that you do. In other words, if you're off the clock and your boss just sent you an urgent request, you'd be wise to ask yourself what a Gen Xer would do. Depends on the Gen Xer. It depends on the human being. Number 4, the tech savvy, but not tech dependent. Just like Gen Xers in the workforce have a different relationship to technology than millennials, the same is true when it comes to their personal lives. Because this group know life before and after the tech boom, they have an excellent understanding of both digital and analog worlds and are equally comfortable with both. Case in point, while millennials don't hesitate to write the next great American novel in a text, Gen Xers prefer to pick up the phone and give you a ring. Wrong. You're wrong. I prefer text. I do. I do. And I know plenty of people who prefer texts in Generation X. I know some boomers who prefer text. Just pulling it out of thin air, writing it down, posting an article on the internet. You are wrong, whoever wrote this article. I'm not even going to use your name. Yeah, you don't know what you're talking about. So, moving on. Number 5, they're fiercely independent. Okay, now this... Okay, let's see where you go here. We've touched on this already, but if there's one defining characteristic of this generation, it would be their self-reliance. Helicopter parenting, lawnmower parenting, snowplow parenting, none of those over-involved forms of child rearing apply to the Gen X generation, many of whom were left to microwave their own dinners and glued to Saved by the Bell. Okay, so yes and no. Yes and no. I think that there was and continues to be a overcorrection from Gen X parents, because people like me who grew up in a broken home, who was a latchkey kid, who had those experiences, I wouldn't say I'm necessarily a helicopter parent per se, but I'm very much involved in my kids' lives as much as I can be, hoping to not hamstring them or do too much for them. Yet at the same time, I will admit, my kids have a level of privilege that I couldn't have possibly imagined. Now, that's really the point. They always say that you want to leave the next generation in a better position than you are. Now, I'm not saying that that's definitely going to happen. I hope that my kids have success in life, but I also don't know where the world is going. Everything from what the jobs are going to be and the experiences are going to be. However, I do know that I have given them more, even from an emotional support standpoint. They've basically, except for a few months, well, I guess my oldest about 2 years, my youngest about 4 months in an apartment, but they've spent, the rest of their lives in family-owned homes. Now, that might seem like no big deal to any of you who grew up in family-owned homes, but for me, it was apartment to apartment to apartment. So that is something that I am fiercely independent, but I don't know that it's made me more or less, I don't know, involved as a parent. I think it's kind of a weird mix here in this particular article. So again, I'm not going to throw this person under the bus, but I really think they missed the bus or the boat, whichever phrase you want to use, as far as what they believe Gen X is. Next up, 29 things that identify you as Generation X. Oh my gosh. Both of these articles have been written by someone named Emma. I didn't know any Emmas growing up. I don't remember that being a particularly popular name. However, for millennials and Gen Z and Gen Alpha, it's a pretty common name. So again, I'm not sure this person understands Gen X. But here we have the 29 things that identify you as Generation X. Let's see about that. Okay. So, first and foremost, your copy of Generation X by Douglas Copeland is dog ears. No. That's stupid. That's stupid. Never read it. Is it interesting? I don't know. Maybe I should have done it for research for the podcast. Yeah, I don't know. Why would I need to buy a book about it? I don't know. You identify with the word slacker, even though you are an upstanding citizen with a full-time job. I alluded to that earlier. You wore acid wash and now hide the photographic evidence. Meh. I guess I wore acid wash jeans from time to time, but okay. Hide the photographic evidence. Molly Ringwald was your girl crush. Or just crush. I see what you did there. I did have a crush on Molly Ringwald. I did. But my true crush in the 80s was Heather Thomas from The Fall Guy. I've mentioned her before on the podcast. That was my crush. I loved Heather Thomas. In moments of stress, you whisper to yourself, "Stay gold, pony boy." No, I've never done that in my entire life. My kids love The Outsiders, by the way. And that was then, this is now. You haven't gotten over River Phoenix or Kurt Cobain's death. I think it's awful. Both of those situations. Awful. I'm over it. I feel badly for their families. I certainly feel bad for, Francis Bean Cobain. It's awful. But I mean, I'm going to carry that with me for the rest of my life. No. You wish Jordan Catalano had ended up being nicer to Angela. Is that My So-Called Life? Is that what that is? Claire Danes? I didn't watch it. You dressed up for a Madonna concert and split a pair of lace gloves with your best friend. Didn't do that. You had arguments over who made the more iconic films, John Hughes or Cameron Crowe. You spelled Quentin Tarantino wrong. You can name all of Martin Sheen's sons and every member of the Brat Pack. Probably. Your tapes of Joy Division, New Order, and Depeche Mode broke, so you had to replace them by going to the record store. You still play Pearl Jam and Dr. Dre and sing along to the Backstreet Boys, and Purple Rain makes you cry. Did you do a Google search for, like, bands? Really? While I would count myself amongst the kind of people who would have a playlist with Joy Division and Dr. Dre, I'm not sure this all makes perfect sense to me, and I didn't really become a Joy Division fan until the probably early 90s. It just wasn't something that really was that big of a deal. I mean, at least in the States, New Order was big, Depeche Mode was big, but New Order was that offshoot of Joy Division. Yeah, I don't listen to Pearl Jam. Purple Rain doesn't make me cry. It's a good frickin' song, though. All right. You know what a record store is. I think if you say to a kid, record store, they'll figure it out. You know what a mixtape is, of course. You also know the agony of making one. Wasn't that hard? Analog challenged, I guess these folks are. Take on Me by a-ha is the first music video you remember watching on MTV. No, false. My dad was super psyched about having MTV very early on, and I did in fact see the Buggles first. Your first email address was an AOL address. No. Nope. Mine was, oh my gosh. I'm trying to remember what I had. Netscape? Did Netscape have email? That was my browser. I know that. Yeah, but I never had an AOL address. I mean, I probably would have just kept it, you know? Troy Dyer might still be your pretend boyfriend. No. Love you, Ethan Hawke. You see Doc Martens in store windows and briefly want a pair again. If you want a pair of Doc Martens, you buy them. I had the plaid ones, you know, because I was going through that ska phase. You got to have some plaid Doc Martens. Those are rad, dude. You know that Heathers was the original Mean Girls. Heathers was the original lot of things, honestly, and sadly prescient, if you think about it, of what would come to pass. The beeps of Pac-Man still make you antsy. So here's the thing. They had these little versions of Pac-Man, right? They were tiny, really. You know, like that big. And it was just a little desktop version. And it made the most horrific sound. And my kids ended up getting like a mini one. Same sound. Awful. You popped your collar, especially while wearing Varnays. I'm not a rich kid, so yeah. Sometimes at the airport you yell, "The plane, the plane!" Absolutely, yes. Tattoo, Hervé Villachez, my boy. Absolutely. You know that Sarah Jessica Parker is really a square peg. Yes. You know that show only ran for one season? When the Berlin Wall fell, you watched it on one of the 3 network TV stations and felt great relief that the Cold War was over. That was 80... What? I didn't feel any great anything. Honestly, it was like a moment, but I didn't really comprehend it at that time. Oh, boy. Now this one. Goodness. The first test of a boy's manners was if he unlocked your car door and then walked around to his side. These automatic locks do reduce a significant amount of chivalry if you don't go out of your way to do it, but at the same time, while chivalry should not be dead, it is also sometimes frowned upon. It's a confusing world we live in. My poor sons when it comes to dating. My daughter too, honestly. So hopefully they don't do much of it. Thursday nights on NBC were must-see, and you never missed it. And here they have a picture of, what is that? I'm not even sure what show they're showing. Is that supposed to be Friends? But to me, I go back to the Cosby, was it Another World? Then there was Cheers, like that whole block. And it was Cheers and like Frasier, like that Thursday night TV. Long before Friends became a thing. Okay, so I did a whole podcast on this, and there is a meme that continues to circulate. So it says here, you still secretly like U2. So there's the meme that says, did anyone ever really like U2? Or was it all just, everyone was too embarrassed to say they did or they didn't or whatever? And I've clearly said I didn't like U2. When I was listening to Master of Puppets, U2 was like awful. Didn't want anything to do with it, right? U2 was legitimately a really, really good band. And the kind of backlash that they've received for who they have become in middle age, much of it on Bono's shoulders, as far as coming off as being very arrogant. But and I don't know if this is true or not, but supposedly the reason that he always wears the sunglasses, which initially did start out as kind of a joke, and the Fly character, is that he had early onset glaucoma and is sensitive to lights. Who knows if that's true or not, but he said so on Graham Norton. It was totally normal to tie up the phone line for 3 hours at night. Yep. If you had a significant other in high school, absolutely. Your afternoons were spent riding your bike with friends and coming home when the streetlights went on. Yeah. Ha! You're still wondering how you got so old. Okay, facts. Debt, lots of it. Meh. Adequate amount of debt. A reasonable amount of debt. So, this list was kind of hit or miss for me. Some stuff they nailed. Some stuff, no, I can't really relate. But again, if you're talking about 1964-5, depending on the metric, through 77 or 78, depending on what you look at, I mean, that's a fair amount of time where you're in your teens for the older Gen X, and, you're just a kid. So it's difficult to really, I think, paint with such a broad brush. So now this last article I have here, let's see. 8 things Gen X kids got away with that would never fly for millennials. Okay. Let's see here. Number 8. Gen X embraced comfort. Here we go again with the flannel. Okay, the grungy generation knew its way around a flannel shirt, but they also liked the hip-hop look and did the pink and green preppy thing, as well as punk. Xers were all about comfort, and the baggier the better. Their style role models were members of Nirvana, Johnny Depp, James Spader in Pretty in Pink, and Run DMC. What? What? Flabbergasted. No. If you were going to talk about one of the grunge bands, it wouldn't have been Nirvana. Johnny Depp, okay. But James Spader and Pretty in Pink, yeah. But honestly, that was more Miami Vice, right? Miami Vice, those were the fashion icons. That lent itself very easily to James Spader and Pretty in Pink. Weird. Gen X wanted their MTV to have music. Well, yeah, it's in the title. Music television. However, I would just like to remind whoever wrote this that the real world, which kicked off, gosh, I should do an episode on the real world, but that kicked off the whole reality TV trend. Let's be honest. MTV did that first. Let's find out what happens when you pick 6 strangers to live in the loft and find out what happens when you stop being nice and start being real. Is that how it goes? Something like that. Yeah, stop being nice and start being real. The real world. So, I think that if I remember correctly, we were very much interested in like the Video Music Awards. That was like a big deal. But then like the different formats and then the news shows and, the interview segments, which were not just about music at a certain point. It became more of a, an entertainment entity. And I got caught up in the early, reality stuff. The real world was much watch viewing, honestly. And I remember one of my buddies sending in a video, like to audition for it. I taped it for him. Yes, big old camera, send in a videotape. Let's see. Gen X tended to be pessimistic. All right, here. So Gen X was exposed to less drastic social change, but more traumatic events, completely out of their control, giving them a rather hopeless outlook, but also quite a practical one. They saw serial killers, the first school shootings, stock market crashes, nuclear reactor disasters, and military invasions. Well, if you're going to put it that way. This left a sense of disillusionment in many, which took time to heal. So, facts. So, this is true. I had read not too long ago, just because I was curious, and I think they're right on the cusp, but the Columbine shooters, I think they're considered Xennials, or they're actually Gen X. And the fact that that happened in the 90s, and I graduated from high school in the 90s. Now, mind you, early 90s. I graduated in 92. But that is very much a part of, our collective experience, I think, to some extent. I think for the early folks in Gen X, they probably see this as very abstract. I think for the early Gen Xers, the serial killer thing, particularly like that boom in California in the late 70s and early 80s, that was pretty significant. Chernobyl, like those kind of things were significant. And, the Vietnam War was going on in my lifetime. There were still soldiers. The last, I guess, bastion of it in 74 when, I was born, this was still happening. And obviously that took a long time for healing. And then all the different, the Gulf Wars and all that. So yeah, there was a certain sense of disillusionment, but I would always hope or expect that, I don't want to say you grow out of it, like you don't forget these things, but you have to, just by virtue of survival, I think you have to get to a point of some hope. Like you have to have hope. Nevertheless, I can completely see Gen X tended to be a little pessimistic. Fair enough. Number 5, Gen X weren't always safe. Okay. Gen X saw a growing prevalence of unsafe and often underage sex, AIDS, and sexually transmitted diseases, thanks to casual hookups and a lack of understanding. This resulted in the AIDS crisis of the 1980s, which gave rise to stronger messages about safety. This is a topic that I don't really want to, I don't know. I don't want to go down there because I think it opens up a lot of different ways that this can be construed and a lot of different, I think people came to these different experiences for different reasons in different ways. But I do think, hopefully, some of these things we've moved past as a society. Yet, one of the things that keeps coming up is different diseases will then spring to the forefront yet again. And it's not just amongst, drug users or people in the gay community. It's all over the place. And all of a sudden there'll be like a spike in, I don't know, gonorrhea or syphilis or whatever it is. So it is rather cyclical, but it says here, millennials found partners more easily thanks to apps. And this generation was very interested in safety. is it really any more or less safe than what we were doing as Gen Xers when we were, quote unquote, hooking up than finding someone on an app and going to their home? Just randomly? Never met you before. We talked on the internet. We texted a couple. Oh, great. Location. Okay, you're 5 blocks away. That doesn't strike me as particularly safe. Number 4. Gen X existed under the radar. Before they grew up to become the largest generation of entrepreneurs, many Gen Xers were considered slackers. They were able to keep what little money they earned because businesses didn't think they would spend it anyway, so they weren't a prime target for advertisers. So you're telling me that Gen X was never in the 18 to 49 demographic? That's stupid. I just think it's stupid. You're going to tell me that when you have something like the quote-unquote grunge explosion, or even all the stuff that was happening prior to that with the hair bands, you're telling me that there wasn't specific marketing? Of course there was. Of course there was. Silly. Gen X at number 3 could say the dog ate their homework. Oh, okay, I see what they're saying. They were the first generation to have phone computers, although for most this would be much later in life. Yeah, I mean, I get what they're saying. It is true that millennials, and certainly my kids, as Gen Alpha, whatever it is, it's really difficult to get away with that because you have to use programs like Turnitin, Google Drive. It's hard to get away with it. So yes, we might have been the last generation to say the dog ate my homework. Oh, what a weird sentence. Number 2, Gen X lived on the edge. Let's see what they say here. Okay. Known as Latchkey Kids, many Gen Xers grew up to be very self-reliant due to attitudes towards safety at the time. Seatbelts and car seats were optional, and when they were preteens, they babysat younger kids, and conversely, when they were young, their caregivers were not much older than they were. Never mind drinking unfiltered tap water. This group slurped from garden hoses. They hung from monkey bars that were mounted on concrete. The horror. I didn't know that this was going to be so close to Halloween. A nightmare of a podcast. Unfiltered tap water 2. Everybody dies. Look, we dealt with a lot of stuff, okay? And I know there are some people, again, I talk about these groups that I'm on, where, we were doing our best to dodge kidnappers. I didn't grow up in that big of a city that I was constantly concerned about kidnapping. I mean, I think it's always a concern. You should always be cautious. I do realize that there were some times I would leave in the morning on my bike and, yes, be gone for the whole day. But they make this so dramatic. Never mind drinking unfiltered tap water. This group slurps from garden hoses. Oh. And number 1. And an early Gen Xer will absolutely say, Gen X were grunge. The alternative rock scene, as well as the independent films, developed out of what was considered Generation X malaise. They made albums to please themselves and tackled weighty subjects like social alienation, homelessness, depression, and addiction. So, wait a minute. Do we care? Do we not care? There were no "Wake Me Up Before You Go-Go" lyrics. The songs were introspective and examined what was wrong with the world. Popular music was sung by Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, and Stone Temple Pilots. The movies were created by Quentin Tarantino, Steven Soderbergh, John Singleton, and Kevin Smith. like I said at the start of the podcast, are we whatever? Are we slackers? Or are we activists? Are we super concerned about what's happening in society? That's where I don't like the broad brushstrokes. That's why I kind of want to do the podcast. Like, what are the tropes? What is it that people believe? What is it that people identify for an entire generation of people? You know, millions and millions of people. People like you who listen to this podcast. Is this representative? It's just so interesting how there are some things that I immediately am like, yes, absolutely, totally feel that. And there are other things I'm like, no, I reject that out of hand. So I guess what it comes down to is I'm fascinated by, just it's a sociological study, if nothing else, and trying to think about my own place in the world and what my experience is, how they've brought me to where that I am, and do I have these generalized similarities to the people around me. Now, one of the things that it said out here was fiercely independent. So although there are times in my life where I very much sought to belong, that wasn't always what was of concern to me, And I think part of it may be born out of being a latchkey kid, right? And just kind of being on my own a lot. But at the same time, you want to be relatable and relate to your peers. And then to a certain extent, those people that you end up being in the workforce with and those kind of things. So I just thought it was a fascinating study because I had seen so many of these memes. I should just do one day, just pop into my social media and just go right down the list of what people post and some of the insane comments that come out. Again, purportedly from people who are in Gen X, making comments to other people where it's like turf war, like some kind of weird flex, as they say. And well, you're not really Gen X if X. Really? Like, again, that flies in the face of a lot of the stuff that I just read. We're really going to hold someone else and say, if you don't like, I don't like Goonies. I don't like Goonies. I don't like Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Well, you're going to lose your Gen X bona fide card. I don't care. I like what I like. So, got some really interesting, I think, episodes coming up soon. Certainly, we're going to be having a couple of guests on the show once again. So you don't just have to listen to my voice babbling away about whatever inanity I decide to at any given week. So I'm really excited about one episode that's going to be coming up pretty soon. I think you'll all really enjoy it. I'm really looking forward to because you couldn't have more different perspectives than the folks that are going to be on. It's going to be very cool. And the first time we'll have a little bit of an international flavor, if you will. So that being said, I would love to know what topics you'd be interested in. Love to know what you think about this podcast and what are some of the things that you identify with as Gen X and what are some things that people maybe assume about Gen X that you don't relate to or you just kind of dismiss out of hand as being a stereotype or a meme, to be honest. So how can you reach out to me? You can find me on Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube at StuckPodX. You can email me at stuckinthemiddlepod@yahoo.com. You can jump over to the Facebook page, which is Stuck in the Middle, a Gen X podcast. Please, please, please like, leave 5-star reviews and comments, and most importantly, you know what I'm going to say, subscribe to the podcast, to the YouTube channel, however you get your content, please subscribe. So, until next time, later, slackers.